What's going on, guys? Welcome to In the Zone. I'm your host, Garrison Roy, and today we're going to have a very special guest for a full-length interview. But if you're new to the show, we do have rants where I go on and vent about specific topics or maybe things I see on social media or trends that I'm seeing in the game. And also mental minutes, which are quick mental hacks to help you stay in the zone. And then also the deep dive educational explorations, whether that's things as far as being sport specific, training specific, or even just more on the psychological side of things. But if you have any future topics or questions, feel free to reach out to in the zone podcast 123 at gmail.com. But without further ado, we're going to go ahead and bring on Tyler Shorter. He has a strength and conditioning background, CSCS, like myself, and he's out in West Virginia at Pro Performance RX. So, Tyler, what's up, dude?
How's it going?
Dude, pleasure to have you on. I've been kind of following you a little bit, seeing some stuff on LinkedIn and Twitter, and liking what you're posting out there. So I was like, hey, let's connect and talk some shop on here.
Yeah, for sure. I've been a listener for a little while, so I'm excited to be on here and get to talk to you and talk shop with everyone. Hopefully, get some information out there that people can do something with.
For sure. Absolutely. Well, and a lot of it too is like, you hear a lot of the coaches that are like, hey, especially us probably growing up as players, like you want to do the basics really well or savagely well, and then everything else will kind of fall into place. You don't want to be the guy who's out there fielding ground balls trying to do like a really flashy like PFP throw or something like that. It's like, hey, sometimes you just gotta get a normal ground ball or and the ways of training, right? Like, hey, get your foundational movements down first, then we can get to the crazy stuff, right? So that's it. Well, tell us a little bit more about your background as far as playing career leading up to where you are now.
Okay, so I'm a Morgantown, West Virginia native, and growing up, like I was always, I'd say, above average for my area. And even throughout high school, like I came in throwing as a freshman relatively hard, um, and had always followed like what I was told to do. And at the time, at least in this area, it was still very much like, oh, baseball players shouldn't lift. You should run
Oh,
long
wow.
distance, like all the
The
conventional
dark age.
wisdom. Yeah, and this was, I mean, I was in high school 2012 through 2015, so it really wasn't that long ago. But I mean, just believing what I was told, and um, I had always gotten by with my natural athletic ability. And once I got to college, that's really the wake up call, not just for me, but for a lot of guys. It's like,
Oh, yeah.
I was the best guy in my area. And then I go into college and it's like, oh, these guys are way better than I could have
Mhm.
ever dreamed of being like at this age. And they
Or you
just,
got a team full of guys that's the same caliber as you, maybe a little bit better, and you're like, oh, okay.
yeah, for sure. And once I got there, I came to that realization and I got injured, and that just really set everything in place and got me started on the path I'm on now. Because after I got injured, I was like, I'm doing something wrong. I've been
Sure.
told to do all this stuff and it didn't work out for me the way I expected it to. So at that point, I kind of reevaluated who I was and what had gotten me to that point, and where to go next. If I really wanted to be in a college uniform and play at that level, I needed to make some serious changes. And that's how I fell in love with coaching and helping other guys get better. Guys like myself, and probably like you were to some degree. It's like, not the most genetically gifted
Oh, same.
in
Yeah.
comparison. Yeah. So just helping those guys out.
That's the name of the game, man. That's what I'm most passionate about too, is like, you have those guys who, you want to call them fringe guys or whatever, like they may or may not be good in high school, or they get away with a little bit of athletic talent, gets them to, some level of college playing, but then now it's like, okay, hey, now what? You got to kind of scratch and claw and be able to make a way to compete, right? And I think a lot of that, especially through our wave of playing, like it's almost a lot of self-education, right? Versus like
Yeah.
maybe a few generations before us, it was like, hey, we're just going to listen to our coach, tell him what he tells us to do. And then, the natural athletic ability just kind of emerged naturally from there, right? But now we have so much information. Sometimes it can be misinformation too, like yourself. Like you got some of the old school things that out there be like, hey, like you don't lift or you don't do this. Or mine was like, hey, you don't overhead press, which led to like shoulder issues, right? Like a lot of those things, you kind of have to be your own best advocate. And even myself, like I'd tell a lot of guys, I'm like, hey, I could be wrong. I could be completely off on this. You search it out for yourself and see what works for you. And you want to open up an environment for that to be able to allow them to explore some things, but also not let them go down the track of like, doing something extremely off the wall, like throwing down a, a roof or something like that, right? Like that's probably a little extreme.
Yeah. Just to touch on that a little bit, I mean, that's something I tell guys all the time. I call it the oh crap moment, right? Everyone gets to a point in their career when it's like, oh crap, and you look around and everyone's just as good or better than you are. And it's like, okay, from this point on, you have two decisions to make. You can either say, hey, I wasn't genetically gifted like some of these guys. I wasn't cut out for it, and just kind of give up your career at that point. Or you can get down to business and be like, hey, look, what do I need to do to be as good as these guys, to
Yeah.
be able to compete at this level? And I've seen one of my best friends, but throughout high school, um, he was never the dude. Like, especially at the youth level, he was terrible. And I hate to say that, but he came to that realization at an early age, and that helped him make a career for himself and get to a good college and actually have a pretty good collegiate career. And it's like, for some guys, coming to that realization sooner rather than later is beneficial, because if you develop years and years and years of certain habits that are associated with, the guys that get by purely on genetics, then how many 20, 23, 25 year olds do you know are going to make that change at that point? So,
Yeah, not many. And or even then when they've gotten to that point, like there's not a whole lot of adaptations that can have in that small window. Right. So it's almost a blessing in disguise when kids, have that realization a little bit earlier of an age, or, like you hear the stories about like Michael Jordan or, any of those guys that get cut from varsity or JV. They decided to make a switch. They weren't like, oh, I give up on the sport, like I'm done with it. And, play the blame game. It's like, oh, the coach is playing favoritism and all this, blah, blah, blah. Like, no, they took ownership of where they were. They're like, hey, I'm 100% responsible for where I'm at right now. And now I have to do some work to get better, is essentially
yeah.
it. Right.
And I
And
think,
go
go
ahead.
ahead. I
No,
was going to say, I think the way we frame it's super important too. Like, I mean, I'm sure you've seen research or heard of research where we fit the job to the time that's allotted to us, right? Procrastination at its finest. But it's like, how do we frame our athletic career in a sense that's like, I don't have the time that I think I have, and every moment that I have absolutely matters. So one of the things I say sometimes, and it was actually more of a story. So the director of baseball at the facility I work at, kids weren't doing well that day, and he was like, you know what, I just want to put them on the line. So puts them on the line, has them run, and that's kind of slightly off topic, but so many kids were not touching the line, right? And in that moment, it doesn't seem like a big deal. And I brought it up to them. I'm like, hey, this is going to sound completely ridiculous, but if I told you that touching that line right there was going to be the difference maker between you being on a college roster and not, would you do it? And overwhelmingly, the answer is, well, yeah, I would do it. But they don't. And I think that's the issue a lot of times is we don't see every decision we making as mattering, right? Because there's no instant instant gratification, or there's no instant sense of like, oh, that helped. It's the long term that players struggle to see. So if we can frame things in a sense that shortens those windows and makes it seem like if we don't act now, then that's the difference maker in our career potentially.
Oh yeah, that's really just kind of more of a definition of integrity, right? Like even if no one's watching you, regardless of like, hey, the coach is watching you, you got to go down and you touch the line. If everyone touches the line, like, hey, like maybe he makes us stop running, right? Like,
Yeah.
but that's a standard that you have to hold for yourself. You're like, hey, I'm still going to do everything right, everything that I need to know how to do, right? I'm going to keep my nutrition in check, my training in check. I'm going to do the boring stuff like the mobility or whatever else that needs to be done. That's not as exciting to do, like, hitting PRs or ripping down, whatever PR, the pull down or, having really good movement on some off speed pitches. Like that's still fun and exciting stuff in the fun days of training, right? But like, yeah, you gotta almost really pay attention to the small details. And what a lot of guys notice, especially whenever all the places I've trained, the pro guys versus the amateur guys is really in the details. Like these pro dudes literally take every single warm up rep. They're fully mentally locked in and they're present with what they're doing, right? Versus like some of the amateur guys. And again, we've all been guilty of this with really anything in our lives, but just like, I'm going through the motions. Like, we're gonna just do this. Oh, gonna do my bands, or blah blah blah. Like, but the pro guys, they're literally like searching me out, and they're like, "Hey, did I do this right? Did is this okay? Like, how can I do this better? Am I feeling this in the right place?" Like, they're actually asking those questions to try to be able to almost not in a sense be perfect, but they're pursuing that excellence of being a professional and taking it super seriously because obviously their life depends on it because they're getting paid to do it, right?
Yeah.
And that's something that we have to, as coaches, we can stress as much as we can, but whenever you have someone around that you're like, hey, like this guy is where you want to be. He's playing in college or he's in the big leagues. Like, look at him. Just proof's in the pudding, man. Or fruit doesn't fall far from the tree, so to speak, right? Like those are the things that, as much as we like to continue to preach those things, right? Like it's a lot easier whenever guys see that and then the culture almost kind of takes care of itself. Like guys are willing to go in and be like, okay, hey, yeah, I need to come in here locked in. I need to come in here and do this. And those are usually the guys that tend to make those big jumps whenever they find out, they have that oh shoot moment. And then all of a sudden now they're able to make that switch. And they're like, oh, okay, yeah, I gotta lock it in here. I gotta stay in the zone every single time what I'm doing.
Yeah, and the difference between going into college and professional baseball at the high school level, the difference between the best guy and the worst guy, that's a very large gap versus when you're at that professional level, any little advantage, and you see guys all the time. I mean, that's how these cheating scandals occur because they're looking just the smallest things make create the biggest advantages for them.
Mhm.
So, they carry that into their training, like you were saying.
Oh, 100%. And to kind of go a little bit back to what you were saying, like a lot of the development of a high school guy, like a high school freshman versus a high school senior, a lot of it is physicality development, right? Like, hey, they haven't fully matured or they're still have a little bit more puberty to go through. Everybody's on a different timeline there. But as soon as you go up to college, like, hey, you're playing against, we were talking about this off air, like you're playing against 24, 25-year-old men now. And you're like maybe 18, 17, 18, maybe even for some kids, a lot younger. And you're probably even further behind of that gap as far as reaching your athletic peak or, being fully developed into where you're at. And as you continue to shorten that, a lot of those windows shorten for room for error. That just really is what it boils down to.
Yeah.
That's it. So how do you, I guess now, you were talking about you got injured. Are you willing to kind of talk about the injuries and that whole process and what that looked like for you?
Yeah. So, I mean, honestly, growing up, I'd always kind of dealt with injuries on and off, and I was never into strength training, never into anything like that. Like I said, I went out, I long tossed, I did whatever my pitching coach told me to do, and like, yep, that was a good day. Wrap it up. Like arm care, nothing like that. So um, I had actually, after I was always a bit overweight, but after I had um, TJ, I got up to 240 pounds, and I'm only like 5'8", so I was a big dude, and it was not good weight. And
Mm.
that was really what kickstarted, like, hey, if I ever want to step on a collegiate mound, like I cannot go out there looking like this. Like, no one's going to take me seriously. I'm not going to be um, competitive in this situation. So I gotten on a program, which I'm not going to name, but it really got me started in the strength training. And I saw just how much that helped me develop, not only for health, but performance. And a big reason for that was because I had no foundation when it came to those things. So
Sure.
I think that's where the misconception a lot of times with, oh, you're going to throw harder after you have TJ. It's like, no, the surgery is not what's doing that for you.
Mm.
It's the fact that you're taking, for a long time, pitchers who were underdeveloped from a strength standpoint, and you're having them do something, because that's the first part of rehab. You have no range of motion, so they have you start strengthening everything else to try
Hmm.
to help. And that's where that misconception of guys coming back throwing harder comes from. But
Yeah.
like I said, it worked for a while, and then I hit a serious plateau and had to, reassess at that point again. Like, hey, this obviously isn't working anymore. What's the next step? What do I need to do next? And it took a long time for me to completely get healthy. I had gotten healthy again, got re-injured, and then I think and you had actually talked either on a podcast or a post about this, but you had said something along the lines of like, I want the coach that's been through it, right?
Hmm.
And I really identified with that because I had to figure out for myself what helps me. I wasn't the guy that was going to roll out of bed and throw 95. So what gets guys to that point when they're not just gifted for that? And what creates that health? What's going to help guys stay healthy? And that's kind of how I found myself to where I am now.
Dude, yeah. I mean, I think we're both on a very similar track of how we progressed athletically. Fortunately, I never had surgeries, but I helped a lot of guys get rehab from those. But, like you said it honestly perfectly early on, where you were like, hey, like, I got to change something here since I got hurt. Like, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again. Like, it would have been awful if you had been like, hey, let's just recover and then we're going to go right back to the same type of throwing mechanics or the exact same type of thing. Right. So, uh, you got to make a change and self assess, especially even the short term. Like, a lot of guys wait. And I'm not saying that you waited until it was time for you to get TJ necessarily, but, some guys wait until it's too late to make a change. It's like, hey, maybe we do this for 2 weeks. If we're getting frustrated, we don't notice any results. Maybe we kind of reassess and be like, hey, what do we need to change in order to do this? Or, it may not even be training related. It's like, hey, are you getting enough sleep? That probably needs to change first, right? Or, hey, are you eating enough calories throughout the day? Are you getting enough protein? Those are probably two big things that if you're not tackling those, that alone could probably improve your performance too. So, but yeah, you gotta be able to just be able to almost self-assess really, right? And obviously we have guys like ourselves, coaches that can help see those blind spots, like I mentioned a few times on some other podcasts too. But it's like, hey, assess, reassess, test it, and just keep kind of cycling through that, right?
Yeah, and I mean that's where monitoring comes into play big time.
Yeah,
Is like,
you gotta make
if you're not measuring your athletes, then how do you know they're getting better? How do you know where to go from where you're currently at? Like, if we have no gauge, what do we do? And it's like, at that point, if in my opinion, if you're working with the coach that's not trying to progress as far as like, hey, what can I learn? What can I start monitoring that may be the difference maker? And even if it's just one guy's career, it matters, right? So that's all I got
yeah.
there.
Oh, absolutely. Well, and it was crazy for me to start measuring things. Like now it's like, okay, hey, we're measuring almost everything. But like when I first started, it was like, hey, you want to get better at long toss? Like measure your long toss distance. I was like, oh, yeah, I'm going to go to Home Depot. I'm going to go get me one of those 300-foot tape measures and we're going to measure how far I can throw. Or, hey, you want to get to throw harder? Probably a good idea to get in front of the radar gun every once in a while versus just like, oh, yeah, it feels harder. Looks good. Because that's kind of where baseball was, right? It was very based on feel and very just like, okay, hey, like, which I think you need both, right? There's not ever really a thing where it's like, hey, you need to be in front of a radar gun every single day, no matter what, unless caveat for that for me is like maybe when you're rehabbing from injury to make sure you're not doing too little or too much. I think that's where you probably need to be using that as a measuring tool of intensity. But as far as in season goes, like you don't need to be in front of a radar gun all the time, but you do also need to measure and see where you're at. So it's kind of also, it's more of a psychological thing too, because some guys can't pitch or throw without maybe chasing a number, right? Because then they're maybe kind of overreaching from themselves. Um, but like you almost had novice gains, like what you're talking about with that training protocol when you first started out and just measuring things, right? Because you're like, hey, where are we on the map? You're going to the mall and you're like, hey, I don't know. We're in the mall, but I don't know where we are, but we're trying to get to this store. So you got to go in, find the name, or maybe you see the really big store like Dick's Sporting Goods or something. And you're like, okay, hey, we're close to that one. Now we know where we're on the map. And now we can actually figure out how to get to the next store where we're trying to go to. Same thing in training, right? Like you got to identify where you are if you're going to get somewhere.
Yeah, and I like to have the radar gun out. We use a pocket radar most of the time, especially for a lot of the drill based throwing we do. But I like to have it on pretty much every throw the guys make on their high intensity days specifically because
Yeah.
I noticed a lot of guys that weren't getting on a radar consistently were mistaking this forceful, effortful throw as like, oh, that was harder. And it's like we have a radar gun up, and now immediately, like the one guy PR'd by on one of the throw variations we were doing, but he PR'd by like 4 miles an hour. And I told him that as soon as he did it, he was like, that didn't feel like a PR because he was
Yeah.
used to having this this forced throw. And I'm like, okay, well, that's the feeling we need to be chasing. We need to be chasing that effortless, like smooth
Yeah.
flowing throw over this effortful, like grindy, I and
Muscling
going
up is
back,
probably another term
yeah,
for it. Yeah.
exactly. And going back into the way we frame things, um, we have to sorry, I lost my train of thought there.
No, you're good. You're framing how you're perceiving the intensity. You were talking about velo being radared on the high intensity throws.
Yeah.
And
Um,
I
so
think it's valuable. You need to have that, but like, maybe it's a recovery day. Maybe you don't get in front of a radar,
yeah,
but
exactly.
it also, you need to have that feel versus like what the actual radar is, because you're not always going to have the radar gun access when you're in the game, right? Like eventually, maybe if you get to a higher level, like you can whip your head around and look at the scoreboard, maybe, or like wherever the radar track reading is. But sometimes you just got to go off feel and developing that. Maybe, it's not an LED board that they see every single throw. Maybe it's like, hey, and I've done this for several guys, like, hey, I want you to chase this feeling of the effortless throwing. I'm going to radar, and you just tell me the feedback of what it felt like. Oh, hey, this one felt muscled up. Yeah, awesome. Guess what? Your velo is lower. Let's try to go for a more effortless flow, smooth movement. Sure enough, a couple of throws later, they get that feeling. Yeah, that was actually better or pretty close to the same. And I think that's a win for that for sure.
Yeah, and it's all about creating that new connection. That's where I started to go was like creating that new association of, oh, wait, this is actually what throwing harder feels like. This is actually what it feels like, this smoothness in the throw. That's where the velo comes from, or that's not just talking about velo, but I noticed myself when I was feeling like that, my control went up, my breaking stuff was better. It's like that's that's the way the throw is supposed to unwind.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And that's where it's going to be the most efficient. It's going to be the healthiest, in my opinion, right? And the easier way for you to stay in here if you're not constantly like, internally focused on what you're trying to do here, 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 like you're going to be able to stay locked in. And I still explicitly remember to this day, like all the games that I was just super zoned in on. I didn't think about my mechanics. I didn't care about the radar gun. I wasn't worried about any of that stuff. I was like, hey, here we go. This pitch here, boom. And it was almost like a movie was being played. Like I was doing the movement, but I was almost kind of like in another world, you know? Have you ever had any games like that where you were just like, dude, I'm so locked in, like everything just feels super effortless and just
Oh yeah,
easy?
I could I could probably count like in college the number of times and distinctly remember them, but that's something I always bring up to my guys. It's like when they're struggling, like if you can think back to a time that you were performing well, what was going through your head? And they always sit there for a second. They're like, nothing. Like, exactly. That's what Hunter Pence had actually had. I think it was, I forget where the video came from, but he talks about that out of body experience that you're referencing. And it just the lack of thinking involved. And I tell my guys, like, you can't think and be an athlete at the same time. It's through our training that we're developing ourselves as an athlete. And once the game starts, you let that person take over. You're no longer thinking, you're no longer trying to feel these certain things. You're out there competing and letting yourself be the athlete you develop through your training.
Yeah, 100%. That's really, in essence, just like gotta let the athlete.
Yeah.
Just like, hey, we can't be overcoaching. We can't try to do too much if you're the athlete. That's where kind of the muscling up terms come up from, is like almost where the psychological piece matches what you're actually physically doing. I've actually found that be pretty correlated to like if they're really like mentally straining, odds are they're probably really physically straining themselves, or, you know, getting really tense versus being free, loose. It's like, hey, like another pitch, here we go. Or like guys with the yips, very similar thing where they're just like, okay, hey, their brain's all over the place. Like they're thinking about this, or thinking about this, or, some other thing that they heard from a coach way back. And they're like, oh, hey, maybe this will work. Like they're scattered. And guess what? Physically, their throws are also scattered, right? Like it's kind of funny how it all is connected, but it is.
Yeah. And I'd had a conversation with one of my guys hitting the other day, and it came down to like he was thinking too much. And as simple as it sounds, it really comes down to like what is the task at hand? And that task is we have to pick up the ball more than anything else. In the box, we have to see the ball. And it's like you're focusing on how you're moving, you're focusing on, what's going on in the cages around us. You're focusing on so many other things, and the last thing on your mind is just picking up baseball. And like I said, I know that sounds simple, but when we narrow that focus and we tune everything else out, it makes a world of difference in the box, but on the mound too. Like, yeah, we should be trying to move a certain way to some degree, but when we're in the game, like you got to let yourself go. You got to
It's
let
got
it
to be
go. And
automatic. Yeah. You're just
yeah,
going and react, see the pitch, hit it, you know. Maybe there's certain situations where you're like, okay, hey, I need to take this opposite field, but that's still external, right? Like you're still like, hey, see the ball, hit the ball this way. You're not thinking my elbow needs to be here or my legs need to be this way. Because, when you strive to try to replicate a swing too, I think I felt guilty of this probably early in my career where I was hitting home runs really well, just like BP was nice. And I'm like, okay, hey, I need to do the exact same thing that I did yesterday. And then I just like almost too rigid. And it was probably the worst round of BP I ever had because it was like almost, I was forcing it again, mentally trying to force it, which caused me to move very rigid and very stiff. So, and hitting wise, that's a whole nother animal too. Like you're having to react and respond, and you deal with a lot of failure and success. pitching is a less of a roller coaster mentally for sure.
Yeah. And the success and failures, a huge one. I know my my second to last year in college baseball, that was something that I was failing like every single outing. And
Mm.
I started framing things in a way that was more so like, hey, maybe all of this went bad, right? But this outing, I was able to do this really well. Let's build on that next appearance. And I was finally able to, instead of beating myself down after every outing, seeing where I was getting better and piecing that together. And then finally, by the time we got to playoffs, pitching really well into playoffs. So if you're a guy that's struggling out there, take something out of every at bat, out of every outing on the mound. Take something out of it that's good if you're struggling, because just that little bit can motivate you and help you get to a better place next game. And when we can piece those together, it makes a world of difference rather than just seeing it as all black and negative, so to speak.
Mm. Yeah, it's either yeah. No, I love that. Everyone thinks maybe a little too black and white. There's a lot of gray that you're gonna have, right? But uh finding just those one little things, even if it's like, hey, I had a terrible day at the plate. What's something I did good on the field? You can even switch the perspective that way, you know, and putting together the small little wins day to day to day, it's going to increase over time. You hear this probably, and I think I've said this on a previous episode, where if you get 0.01% better every single day, it's 1% roughly over the course of a month or so. Over the course of a year, that's 12% better. And, if you get 12% or 12 miles an hour on a fastball, so to speak, if you're starting from a low, you know, middle school kind of like level where you're throwing 70, 12 miles an hour is a game changer, you know? So you got to keep continuing to build on those things and continue to build and not let the days or any of the failures take you down or allow that frustration to get you off track or get you off of the consistency of what you're already doing. But what are some things, like if you notice a kid that you're training and you're seeing on the floor, and he's frustrated or he's just down in the dumps, like what are some go-to things that you would talk to him about or maybe help him kind of push through that frustration?
Ooh. So one that I try to reserve for special occasions, but it's a talk I've had with a few guys, and it's I don't know if you've ever looked into stoicism, um,
Yeah.
but
Ryan Holiday's got some really good books on that for sure.
yeah,
Actually
yeah.
got right.
So the one guy, okay, the one guy, he was having a hard time. So the previous offseason we had worked together, and he had peaked at like 86 miles an hour, which for him was a pretty big PR. In the following offseason in our pitching group, all of his bullpens up to this point were like 82, 83, 81, like peaking. And he was getting
Mm.
really, really frustrated. And I sat him down and I asked him simply, does good and bad exist? Does good and bad exist? And his immediate reaction was like, yeah, absolutely. Like, I can go out and give up 20 runs, or I could go out and give up no runs. And like, that's good and bad. And he, like I said, he got really upset at the time. But I don't want to give the full conversation, but when we got down to it, it's like, it's all in the way we perceive events.
Mm.
And it's like, we have to take things as they are. And what had happened was I had given them an end of the off season questionnaire, just kind of assessing not just me, the program, and assessing themselves. And one of the questions was, I feel like I've improved this off season. And he circled, it was like a 1 to 5 scale, and he circled like a 2. And that's why I sat him down, because I was like, you're thinking strictly in the fact of velocity, right? Think of everything. So you're telling me you haven't gotten anything mentally out of this, as opposed, like, you don't think you're any stronger mentally, you don't think your stuff's moving any better, you don't think you're better at locating. And he's like, well, yeah. I was like, okay, so if you walk into this next pin and you pop an 87 or an 88, are you still going to circle it too? He was like, no, obviously not. I was like, okay, well, you have to frame things in a way that like you have to understand you've gotten better in so many other ways, and it's not your velocity that you need to live and die by, because there's nothing that separates you on those really good days and those really bad days. You're the same person. You're capable of the same exact thing. So you've got to take that day as it is and move on from that point and say, like, hey, results weren't what I needed them to be today. That's fine. Move on, reassess, and then be better next time. But once he did that, funny enough, his very next pin after we had that conversation, he ended up popping like an 88. And I was like, hey,
Dude,
man,
what? That's
yeah.
awesome.
I was like, that's a great day. And he looked at me and was just like, just a day. Because he had finally grasped that.
Figured
And
it
I
out.
can,
Yeah.
he had figured it out that like, man, it's all in the way we perceive things. And one of the questions I asked him in that conversation was like, if if you have a girlfriend, right? He had a girlfriend. I said, you text your girlfriend after the game and she says, how'd the game go? And you say, I gave up 5 runs in 3 innings. What's her first question going to be? Is that good or bad? Because
If she isn't a baseball fan, yeah.
if she's not a baseball fan, she has no concept of what's good and bad in the sport. So simply because we know and we have this understanding of the game, we frame things in that sense. And you've
Mm.
got to be able to just take it as it is and move on.
Yeah. Well, you take it as it is, and you hear a lot of old timers say, like, hey, you got to have short-term memory loss out there. It's basically essentially like what you just said, right? Like, hey, chalk it up as a bad day, move on. Or, hey, like this happened. Does good or bad exist? I really love that. That's awesome. Way to phrase that too, where like, hey, like, was this something that I can control? No? Okay, cool. Or hey, like bad velo day. What's bad velo? Zero,
Yeah.
probably. If I can't throw at all, that's probably worse. Like getting a little bit more perspective into it, I guess. But no, I love that. And the fact that he even PR'd after that to just have that almost different perspective of, he's putting too much weight on this one thing. And, that's so true for so many guys, especially even not even at the younger levels, even the pro guys, right? Like some of them are putting so much weight on velocity because they're having to hit a certain number roughly to be able to even potentially play at the next level, right? So then they put all that weight on it, and then they don't PR, they continue to spiral down because they're putting so much pressure on themselves, and they're like, oh, good or bad, or hey, hit a PR, didn't hit a PR, and a lot of that almost in a sense, it's almost like self-bullying, if that makes any
Yes,
sense, right? Like you're
absolutely.
literally mentally beating yourself up every time that you do that if you're saying that that's good or bad.
And you just have to recognize, like, am I taking the steps necessary to be a better baseball player than I was the day before? And if the answer is yes, you can let it go. Now, if you're missing a ton of things, right? Maybe that's something that you can be a little more frustrated about because you're not taking the steps necessary. But if you're doing everything in your power to be a better player, then you just gotta let the deck fall how it falls, let the cards fall. So
No, I'm totally with you on that. Like, yeah, it's one thing if it's something you can totally control, for example, like everybody hates it, but it happens in practice. They're gonna go over it. Like bunt defense situations or like PFPs, pickoffs, right? Like nobody likes to do them, but the teams who do a really good job at them are probably going to put themselves in a better chance to win. And it could be one play out of the entire game, right? But if you are making the same mistake, you're missing the same sign every single game, probably didn't get better at that one thing. And that's a controllable, really. It's like, hey, maybe you didn't get the guy out, you didn't pick him off, but you went and picked a second whenever there was a run on first and third. Like, what are we doing? Like that's just a sense of awareness that you probably need to pick up on a little bit and know it's like, hey, all right, that is something I can control and actually improve. Is getting a sign correct or not missing a sign, especially if you're a hitter and you're in the box, not missing a bunt sign or, hit and run, steal. Those things, if it's the first couple times, okay, yeah, sure, miscommunication with the coach, understandable. But if it's a common reoccurring thing, that's where you need to have some self-evaluation and be like, all right, yeah, I need to kind of figure this out a little bit and make an adjustment. So, well, yeah, man. Well, Tyler, what else has been kind of on your mind lately as far as training? What's been something maybe you're seeing this reoccurring theme of guys? You talked about muscling up for things, but what else have you been seeing on your side for the players that you are in contact with?
So, speaking on like the strength side specifically, I
Oh yeah,
think
let's get in there.
I think a lot of people are, and we absolutely have to have a foundation of strength. We have to have a strength base, but I think, and I know I was guilty of it in my career. I was chasing bigger weight room numbers. Oh, I've got to clean more. Oh, I've got to squat more. In associating those with a higher velocity or better performance.
Mhm.
It's like we have to understand that our game, the game of baseball, is about moving very light weights fast. And
Mhm.
yeah, it's super important because being stronger, putting up bigger numbers gives us the capacity to be faster. But at the end of the day, if we're not training to be fast, it's not going to help us. It doesn't it doesn't mean anything if I can get 405 pounds off the bar or off the ground. If I'm grinding that and I'm grinding 65 pounds off the floor as well, and I can't move that quickly, it's not going to translate to the field. So, like I said, having that strength base and developing strength, especially at the youth, middle school, high school level, is super important because they don't have that foundation yet. But when you start to get into training upper level athletes, it just needs to be enough, in my opinion. You
Mhm.
just need to be strong enough. And if we can be strong enough and really get after our power and speed development, that's really what needs to stay at the forefront of our training is being able to move a 5.25-ounce ball quickly, being able to move a 36-ounce bat quickly. Like
Mhm.
the strength isn't as necessary as I think some people make it out to be.
No, I totally agree with you on that. I think, you go back to the strength velocity curve and this whole wave of strength training that's came in, especially early in our careers, where like people were so anti it, and then now you have the very, very pro guys on the opposite side, right? Like two very extremes. The guys who are over here that were very all pro strength training are usually the power lifters that hang out a lot on that heavy, slow, type of lifts, which again, like very beneficial and great to lay a foundation on. But now you got to take those movements and get a little bit more towards that speed side of the spectrum. And if you're not doing things explosively like med balls or anything like that, right, then you're kind of, you're going to have some novice gains at first, but, at some point you're going to hit a plateau and it's not going to be as beneficial versus actually increasing your rate of force development or increasing anything that's closer to what your sport's actually going to be like. That the fast twitch muscle fibers versus slow, or just how you're going to actually produce force. It all matters.
Yeah, and another thing I don't think is trained enough is working on the eccentric portion of exercises big time, especially in most sports. I mean, outside of football and combat based sports, like we're not trying to push around another guy that's 250 pounds. Like we're working with
Yeah.
super light implements, and more than anything else, we're moving our body.
Mhm.
So I think a lot of our training currently is focused on closing. Pretty much everyone knows that we're stronger in the eccentric portion of an exercise than we are in the concentric. So if we're doing a bicep curl, we're going to be stronger. We can let down more weight slowly than we can curl up.
Yeah.
And a lot of our training currently is closing that gap between our concentric abilities and our eccentric abilities. which I think is kind of detrimental to the health of a lot of players because if we think of it on the mound, if if we're accelerating just as well or better than we can decelerate, we're going to run into some injury issues and even performance issues. I mean, there's some people really on it right now, but the power comes from the ability to decelerate. It comes from our ability to break forces and redirect them up. And if there's no braking, if there's no eccentric portion, right, it's not going to make its way into the implement, whether that be the bat or the baseball. So,
100%. Yeah. It's almost like I've heard this adage, where guys are like, hey, I'm going to give you a Ferrari, but the brakes are shit. Good luck. You're probably not going to go very fast in that car. Like, you're not going to crank it up to 120 because your brakes are bad. Your body's kind of
if
the
you,
same thing, right? It's going
yeah,
to regulate on how well those brakes work.
yeah, and we have to be super careful about how we implement the eccentrics because they're really tough on our body. And then on top of that, when we're implementing them, so the doing a ton of the eccentric based work is going to break down our muscles more. So we can do concentric based stuff and we can do isometric based stuff all the time, and
Yeah.
it's
And
gonna
season, ride it out into the sun.
yeah,
Yep.
exactly. But eccentric, that's gonna create a lot of that fatigue, that soreness. So if you're in the collegiate sector or you're working, if you're a high school coach or something like that, planning that accordingly and maybe focusing on it mostly in your off-season programs. And then once you get into the in-season stuff, sprinkle it in. And that goes the same for, chasing more strength and maximal strength. It's like, yes, it still needs to be a part of our program, but once again, keeping speed, power, and creating that eccentric strength at the forefront, and then sprinkling in the maximal strength stuff and um, the more concentric based training as well.
Dude, yeah. No, 100%. I'm with you on that because you need to touch on it a little bit here and there whenever you can in season or maybe mid-season during the week whenever you're not getting ready for a game the next day. You got to hit all spectrums of that force velocity curve. Otherwise, if you're, people try to compartmentalize it where it's like, hey, we're just doing eccentrics in this time, just doing isos, just doing concentric, just doing speed stuff. If you're only doing light weights and speed, like in season, you never really touch anything on that other side, like you're probably going to lose some of those gains just out of lack of recency effect basically. But also after 4 weeks, we've all read the studies, after that 4 weeks is when you start to lose some of those strength gains if you don't ever revisit that, right?
Yeah, and that's also why we gotta hit the power and speed stuff because that starts to
Thing. Yep.
we start to make losses or not make losses, but we start to lose on those after I think it's 5 ± 3 days or so. So if
Yeah.
we're not hitting on that plyometric base work, that speed based work consistently, then we're not going to hold on to it very long.
No, couldn't have said it better. Absolutely. And I think from what you're getting at, it actually made me remember triphasic of where Caldice was talking about, the eccentric versus concentric, and he has the demonstration of a V. Talks about one athlete that's really slow, so his V is really, really wide, and another athlete who's really quick, fast, and his V is very, very narrow. He said that the athletes that are really explosive and are able to get through things really quickly, of those eccentric portions, they have a very, very narrow V, basically. Or some guys that it might be really strong in the eccentric, but then the concentric's like really, really slow. Like they go down fast and then they're like really struggling to get up. That's a little out of whack. And that's kind of going back to what we were talking about before. If you're leaning more too much on one side, like you're grinding on that more absolute strength side and never touching on the other ones, that V or the eccentric to concentric time is very, very large. You need that to be as short as possible. Cool. Well, Tyler, That's all I pretty much got for you, my man. Do you want to leave us out with any closing thoughts, how to get in touch with you, and if any guys want to ask questions or reach out, how can they do that?
Yeah, for sure. I have pretty much all forms of social media. I'm a really creative guy, so I think on most platforms I'm just coach. Yeah, so like TikTok at coach underscore Tyler underscore shorter, and that's pretty much the one I keep on most social media platforms. But feel free to follow me. Feel free to reach out, message me. I mean, I'm like I said, I was never the gifted guy, so I'm all about helping guys, and that's why I stay on in the private sector more so than the collegiate sector, because I'd rather have a bigger impact on the guys that want to get after it than have to spread myself across 20 guys when only 3 of them care. So I'm more than happy to answer questions, and message me if you want to do any sort of remote training, anything like that, or just general questions as well. So
Love it. I love it. Awesome. Well, those of you tuning in, appreciate it and stay in the zone.